Some verdicts aren't delivered by a judge. They arrive the moment the truth looks you in the eye. The marble hallway outside the Fulton County Courthouse echoed with the steady rhythm of polished shoes, muted conversations, and the distant knock of a judge's gavel filtering through thick wooden doors. Morning sunlight slipped through towering windows, stretching long beams across the black and white floor as attorneys hurried between courtrooms carrying folders packed with lives waiting to be rewritten. Television crews adjusted their cameras. Deputies stood at every entrance. Reporters whispered into microphones, sensing another ordinary hearing in another ordinary courthouse. No one knew they were about to witness a moment that would haunt everyone in that building. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the security checkpoint, his crisp white uniform pressed to perfection, his silver badge gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. 28 years in law enforcement had carved deep lines into his face and an even deeper certainty into his mind. He believed experience gave him the right to judge people before they ever opened their mouths. Years of applause from fellow officers had convinced him that instinct was always correct. When Daniel's eyes settled on the young black woman walking calmly toward courtroom 4, something inside him tightened. She wore a charcoal coat over a navy dress, carrying only a leather portfolio pressed against her side. Her posture was straight, her pace measured, her expression unreadable. Her natural curls framed a face that remained remarkably calm despite the dozens of curious eyes following her through the hallway. Her name was Naomi Carter. She had spent years standing beside people the system had overlooked, defending voices that were too often ignored. Today she wasn't there to argue a case. She had come to testify. But no one around her knew that. Daniel stepped directly into her path. Identification. Naomi stopped without hesitation. She looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet composure. "Good morning, officer." Her voice was steady. Respectful. Calm. Something about that calm irritated him more than open defiance ever. "Could I ask for identification?" Daniel repeated, louder this time. Several people slowed their steps. A television cameraman instinctively pointed his lens toward the growing confrontation. Naomi reached slowly into her portfolio. "I'm here as a scheduled witness." Daniel barely glanced toward the folder. "You people always have an explanation." The hallway grew noticeably quieter. A young clerk lowered the stack of files in her arms. Two law students exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. Naomi did not respond. Instead, she held out her court credentials with both hands. Daniel snatched the papers away, scanning them for barely a second before tossing them back against her chest. "I've seen fake credentials before." The folder slipped from Naomi's hands. Documents scattered across the polished floor. Still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply bent down, gathering each page one by one. For reasons even Daniel himself couldn't explain, her silence only fueled his anger. He reached forward abruptly. His hand grabbed the collar of her coat. "Let's see what you're hiding." With one violent jerk, the fabric tightened around Naomi's shoulders before the coat slid partly away. Gasps rippled through the hallway. Several attorneys froze in place. A court reporter instinctively covered her mouth. The movement was so sudden that a delicate silver chain snapped free beneath the collar. Something small struck the marble floor with a clear metallic click. It spun once. Twice. Then stopped. A tiny heart-shaped locket rested beneath the courthouse lights. Daniel's eyes drifted downward. For the first time that morning, his expression changed. The color slowly drained from his face. His breathing caught. Every sound inside the hallway seemed to disappear beneath the deafening silence filling his mind. Because engraved on the worn silver surface were two initials. DB, initials he hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. The crowd noticed only that the officer who had seemed so certain moments before was suddenly unable to move. Naomi looked down at the locket, then quietly picked it up. Her fingers closed around it with extraordinary care, as though it carried far more than silver inside its weathered shell. She lifted her eyes toward Daniel once again. There was no hatred in them. No triumph. Only the quiet weight of a truth that had waited decades for this exact hallway, this exact morning, and this exact moment to finally begin revealing itself. For several endless seconds, no one moved. The courthouse hallway, moments ago alive with hurried footsteps and quiet conversations, became eerily still. Even the distant echo of a judge's gavel seemed to fade beneath the crushing silence that now surrounded Officer Daniel Brooks. His eyes never left the small silver locket resting in Naomi Carter's palm. It couldn't be. Not here. Not after all these years. His heartbeat pounded so violently that it drowned out every other sound. Memories he had buried beneath decades of uniforms, promotions, and carefully constructed excuses suddenly forced their way back to the surface. The same heart-shaped locket. The same worn engraving. Years ago, he had given an identical necklace to a young woman named Angela Carter. He remembered a summer evening beside the Chattahoochee River. He remembered promising a future he never intended to fight for. He remembered saying that nothing, not family, not public opinion, not the color of their skin, would ever separate them. He had believed those words. At least until reality demanded a choice. Naomi gently fastened the broken chain around her fingers before slipping the locket into her coat pocket. She noticed the fear spreading across Daniel's face. But she said nothing. She simply gathered the remaining documents from the marble floor with slow, deliberate movements, refusing to let humiliation define her. Around them, whispers slowly returned. What just happened? Did you see his face? Why did he suddenly stop? A court bailiff stepped closer. Officer Brooks? Daniel didn't answer. His breathing remained uneven. His stare remained fixed on Naomi as though he were looking at someone he had seen only in dreams. Or nightmares. Finally, Naomi stood. She brushed invisible dust from her coat and carefully straightened the stack of legal files against her chest. You. Damaged court documents, she said quietly. Her voice carried no anger. No accusation. Only simple truth. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in nearly 3 decades wearing a badge, confidence abandoned him. His voice cracked. I thought. But he couldn't finish the sentence. Because he no longer knew what he thought. The woman standing before him looked far too young to carry memories from 30 years ago. Yet the resemblance refused to disappear. The shape of her eyes. The quiet determination. The calm expression that somehow reminded him of Angela every time she refused to argue. It was impossible. And yet. His instincts, the same instincts he had trusted his entire career, were whispering something terrifying. The courtroom doors opened behind Naomi. A clerk called her name. Ms. Naomi Carter, the judge is ready for your testimony. She nodded politely. Before walking away, she paused beside Daniel for only a brief moment. Without looking directly at him, she spoke softly enough that only he could hear. My mother always said the truth never gets lost. Then she continued toward the courtroom. Daniel watched her disappear through the heavy oak doors. His legs suddenly felt weak. Questions flooded his mind faster than he could control them. Why that locket? Why Angela's last name? Why did her voice sound so painfully familiar? And why had she looked at him, not with hatred, but with the quiet sadness of someone who had already accepted a wound long before he even knew it existed? Inside courtroom 4, spectators settled into their seats, unaware that the most important case of the day might no longer be the one listed on the docket. Because outside those courtroom doors, another trial had already begun. It wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about testimony. It wasn't even about the law. It was about a man who had spent 28 years believing he could outrun his past, only to discover that his greatest judgment had quietly walked back into his life wearing the face of a woman he had never truly known. Inside courtroom 4, justice wore its usual disguise. Dark oak walls stretched toward the high ceiling. The American flag stood motionless behind the judge's bench. Every chair was occupied. Lawyers shuffled through thick binders. Journalists prepared their notebooks. Families sat with anxious expressions, hoping that today the system would finally hear them. Few realized they were about to witness a truth far greater than the case printed on the court calendar. Naomi Carter walked to the witness stand with quiet confidence. Her heels echoed softly against the polished wooden floor. Every step was measured. Every breath controlled. She had spent years inside courtrooms like this one, standing beside victims whose voices had been ignored, distorted, or buried beneath official reports. She understood something most people never did. Justice rarely arrived with applause. More often, it arrived in silence. Judge Harold Whitman adjusted his glasses before looking toward the witness stand. "Ms. Carter, please remain available until you're called." Naomi nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor." She took her seat near the front row, placing her leather portfolio carefully on the table beside her. From the back of the courtroom, Daniel Brooks entered several moments later. The confidence he usually carried had begun to crack. His uniform was still immaculate. His badge still reflected the overhead lights. Yet inside, nothing felt steady anymore. His eyes searched the room almost immediately. They found Naomi. She didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she quietly reviewed several pages of handwritten notes. That somehow disturbed him even more. Imagine standing only a few feet away from someone who may hold every answer you've spent decades running from. Imagine realizing the past hasn't disappeared. It's simply been waiting. Daniel swallowed hard. His fingers unconsciously brushed the wedding ring he still wore, although the marriage itself had become little more than routine years ago. He tried convincing himself there had to be another explanation. Thousands of lockets looked alike. Thousands of women carried the last name Carter. Coincidences happened every day. Didn't they? The courtroom doors opened again. An elderly woman entered slowly, supported by a polished wooden cane. Her silver hair rested neatly beneath a cream-colored hat. Though age had bent her posture, dignity remained untouched. The moment Naomi noticed her, she immediately stood. Grandma Evelyn. Her smile was gentle. Authentic. She embraced the elderly woman with remarkable tenderness before helping her into the front row. Daniel's chest tightened. He recognized the woman instantly. Not because he had seen her recently. Because 30 years earlier. She had looked him directly in the eyes and warned him. "If you walk away from my daughter today," Evelyn Carter had said, "one day you'll pray for another chance." He remembered dismissing those words. He had been young. Ambitious. Terrified that marrying a black woman would destroy the career he had fought so hard to build. He had convinced himself leaving was the practical decision. The responsible decision. Now those memories returned with brutal clarity. Across the courtroom, Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes. For a brief moment. She looked directly at Daniel. Recognition flashed between them. She didn't appear surprised. She didn't look angry. Instead, there was something even heavier. Disappointment. The kind that survives decades. The kind that never truly disappears. Daniel quickly looked away. His heartbeat accelerated again. No. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not here. Then the courtroom clerk rose to announce the next witness. "Before we proceed," she said, "the court acknowledges the attendance of Ms. Naomi Carter and Mrs. Evelyn Carter." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. Both names. Spoken together. The same surname. The same family. The same past he had abandoned without ever looking back. And for the first time in his life, the veteran officer who believed he could read anyone at first glance realized he had completely failed to recognize the two people who had silently carried the consequences of his greatest mistake for nearly 3 decades. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as the first witness was sworn in. Every eye turned toward the front of the room. Every recorder began capturing. Every notebook opened. Judge Harold Whitman leaned forward slightly. "Counsel, you may proceed." The civil rights attorney approached the podium and began presenting evidence surrounding the excessive force case that had drawn media attention across the state. Photographs appeared on the courtroom monitors. Surveillance footage was prepared. Witnesses waited outside to be called one by one. Naomi Carter listened without interruption. She wasn't distracted. She wasn't nervous. She had spent months preparing for this day, knowing that facts, not emotion, would carry the greatest weight inside a courtroom. Yet she could still feel Daniel Brooks watching her. From the opposite side of the room, he struggled to focus on the proceedings. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted back toward Naomi. The curve of her smile. The calmness in her posture. The way she folded her hands while listening. Each detail awakened another memory he had tried to bury. Angela had done the exact same thing whenever she wanted to hide disappointment behind dignity. Daniel closed his eyes for only a second. That was all it took. A flash of memory returned. A rainy afternoon. Angela standing beside an old bus station, holding his hands. "I'm pregnant." He remembered the joy that lasted only a heartbeat. Then came fear. Fear of losing his career. Fear of disappointing his parents. Fear of what people in his department would say about a white officer starting a family with a black woman. That fear had spoken louder than love. And he had listened. The sharp sound of the judge's gavel pulled him back into the present. "Officer Brooks." Daniel looked up. The judge was watching him. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, Your Honor." But everyone could hear the hesitation in his voice. Across the gallery, several reporters quietly exchanged puzzled looks. The decorated officer who usually projected absolute confidence now seemed distracted, almost shaken. Naomi noticed it too. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she allowed herself a brief glance toward him. Their eyes met. Only for a moment. Daniel expected anger. He expected resentment. Perhaps even satisfaction. Instead, he saw compassion. Not forgiveness. Not affection. Just the quiet compassion of someone who understood that guilt could become its own prison. The feeling unsettled him more than any accusation ever could. Moments later, the courtroom clerk approached Naomi. "Ms. Carter, you'll be the next witness." Naomi stood gracefully. She buttoned her charcoal coat, picked up her portfolio, and walked toward the witness stand with measured confidence. Every camera in the room subtly shifted in her direction. Daniel felt his pulse racing once again. Something inside him whispered that once Naomi began speaking, nothing in his life would remain the same. She placed one hand on the Bible. "I swear that the testimony I am about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "I do." As she settled into the witness chair, the courtroom became impossibly still. Then the attorney asked the first question. "Ms. Carter, before we discuss today's case, would you please tell the court a little about yourself?" Naomi drew a slow breath. She looked briefly toward the spectators. Then, almost unintentionally, her eyes found Daniel once more. "The answer," she said softly, "actually begins long before I was born." The room fell silent again. And Daniel suddenly realized that the story about to unfold wasn't only hers. It was his as well. Naomi rested her hands gently on the edge of the witness stand. The courtroom waited. No one shuffled papers. No one whispered. Even the reporters lowered their pens, sensing that whatever came next would reach far beyond the excessive force case listed on the docket. The attorney offered a reassuring nod. "Take your time, Ms. Carter." Naomi inhaled slowly. "My name is Naomi Carter. I'm a civil rights attorney. For the past 7 years, I've represented families who believed the justice system had forgotten them." Her voice was calm. Clear. Steady. "I grew up believing that truth matters most when it's the hardest thing to tell." Several jurors exchanged thoughtful glances. The attorney continued. "Who taught you that?" A faint smile appeared on Naomi's face. "My mother." She paused. "Angela Carter." Daniel's fingers tightened around the wooden railing beside him. The name struck him with the force of a physical blow. Angela. For nearly 3 decades he had avoided speaking her name aloud. Now it echoed through the courtroom where every word was recorded forever. Naomi continued. "My mother raised me alone." She didn't dramatize the sentence. She simply stated it as fact. She worked double shifts at a hospital. Some nights she came home too tired to eat. But no matter how exhausted she was, she always reminded me that bitterness can become another kind of prison. Daniel lowered his eyes. Every sentence seemed to peel away another layer of the life he had built around himself. The attorney walked a few steps closer. "Did your mother ever speak about your father?" Naomi became quiet. For several seconds, only the soft hum of the courtroom ventilation could be heard. "She answered every question I asked." Naomi's voice softened. "But she never answered with hatred." Another pause. "When I was little, I kept asking why other children had fathers at school events while mine never came." Her eyes drifted toward the courtroom windows. "My mother would simply tell me that some people spend their entire lives running from fear." Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered that fear. His captain warning him that an interracial relationship could destroy public trust. His own father insisting that people like Angela didn't belong in their family. His younger self choosing acceptance over courage. The attorney spoke again. "Did she ever tell you your father's name?" Naomi looked directly ahead. "No." Daniel looked up instantly. "No." She believed names weren't what defined people. Naomi's expression remained peaceful. "She told me that character always reveals itself eventually." Those words landed harder than any accusation. Because Daniel remembered hearing Angela say almost the exact same sentence many years ago. A memory surfaced with painful clarity. She had smiled while placing the silver locket into her purse. "If we ever have a child," she had whispered, "I hope they grow up judging people by what they choose to become." Daniel had promised she would never raise that child alone. It was the last promise he ever kept for less than a week. The attorney reached for another document. "Ms. Carter, why did you agree to testify in today's case?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like." Her eyes slowly turned toward Daniel. Not accusing. Not hostile. Simply honest. No uniform should ever become permission to forget someone's humanity. The word settled over the courtroom like a heavy silence. Daniel felt every eye shifting toward him. For the first time in his career, the badge on his chest no longer felt like a symbol of honor. It felt unbearably heavy. And somewhere deep inside him, a terrible realization had begun to take shape. If Angela had never told Naomi his name, then how had Naomi recognized him the moment they met in that courthouse hallway? The question lingered in Daniel Brooks' mind like an echo that refused to fade. If Angela had never told Naomi who her father was, then how had she recognized him? His pulse grew louder with every passing second. Across the courtroom, Naomi remained composed, her hands folded neatly before her. She didn't appear anxious. She didn't search for sympathy. She spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for difficult conversations. The attorney glanced at his notes. "Ms. Carter, you mentioned your mother never told you your father's name." "That's correct." "So, when did you first become curious?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I don't think I was curious." The attorney raised an eyebrow. "I was searching for understanding." The courtroom became still once more. "When you're a child," Naomi continued, "you don't ask why someone stayed. You ask why someone left." Daniel felt the word strike somewhere deep inside him. She wasn't accusing him. She was describing the loneliness he had created. "My grandmother taught me that carrying anger would only allow another person's decision to shape my future." Naomi looked briefly toward Evelyn Carter. "So instead of searching for someone who walked away." She paused. "I focused on becoming someone my mother would be proud of." A quiet murmur spread through the spectators. One of the reporters slowly lowered her pen. This no longer felt like ordinary testimony. It felt painfully personal. The attorney nodded respectfully. "Then what changed?" Naomi reached into the inside pocket of her coat. Daniel instinctively leaned forward. She carefully removed the silver heart-shaped locket. The same one that had fallen onto the courthouse floor. Its surface reflected the courtroom lights as she held it gently between both hands. "This belonged to my mother." She turned it over. "My grandmother gave it to me after my mother's funeral." Daniel's breathing became shallow. The attorney spoke softly. "May I?" Naomi handed him the locket. He examined the faded engraving before displaying it to the court. "D.B." The initials appeared on the courtroom monitors. Daniel stared at the screen. He remembered engraving those two letters himself at a small jewelry shop nearly 30 years earlier. He had been 26. Certain he was building a future. Certain he had time. He had been wrong about both. The attorney continued. "Did your grandmother explain these initials?" Naomi nodded. "She did." Daniel's heart nearly stopped. "My grandmother told me they belonged to a man who once promised my mother forever." Silence. "But she also told me something else." Naomi's voice remained remarkably gentle. "She said people often become prisoners of the fears they refuse to confront." Daniel slowly lowered his head. Every sentence felt less like testimony. And more like a mirror. The attorney placed the locket back into Naomi's hands. "So, when did you finally learn who those initials belonged to?" Naomi looked toward the courtroom windows before answering. "It happened 6 months ago." Daniel looked up instantly. 6 months. "I requested my mother's archived medical records while organizing family documents." She paused. "Inside one of the files was an unopened envelope addressed to me." Every person inside the courtroom leaned forward. "My mother wrote it shortly before she passed away." Daniel's hands began to tremble. "Inside that letter." Naomi swallowed carefully. "She finally wrote my father's full name." The courtroom fell into complete silence. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. For nearly 30 years, he had believed the past had disappeared without leaving a trace. He had never imagined that somewhere, tucked inside a forgotten envelope, Angela had quietly preserved the truth. Waiting. Not for revenge. But for the day her daughter would be strong enough to carry it. No one spoke. The silence inside courtroom 4 became almost unbearable. Naomi still held the letter in both hands, its folded edges softened by time. The yellowed paper looked ordinary, hardly the kind of object that could shake a courtroom filled with judges, attorneys, deputies, and reporters. Yet everyone sensed it carried a truth that had waited decades to be heard. The attorney broke the silence. "Ms. Carter, did you bring the letter with you today?" "I did." Her answer was almost a whisper. She carefully unfolded the paper, taking a brief moment to smooth its creases with her fingertips. Daniel couldn't breathe. He remembered Angela's handwriting. Small. Elegant. Every letter perfectly formed. He had once teased her for rewriting grocery lists until they looked beautiful. Now those same careful strokes threatened to expose everything he had spent 30 years trying to forget. The attorney spoke gently. If you're comfortable, would you read the portion you believe is relevant to the court? Naomi nodded. She looked down at the page before beginning. My dearest Naomi. If you're reading this, it means I've left this world before finding the courage to tell you everything myself. There is one truth I never wanted you to mistake for rejection. Your father did not leave because you were unworthy of love. He left because he was afraid. Fear makes ordinary people abandon extraordinary things. And sometimes, they spend the rest of their lives pretending that choice never happened. A wave of emotion swept quietly across the courtroom. Several spectators lowered their heads. Even one of the court deputies blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Daniel's vision blurred. Those weren't simply Angela's words. They were the judgment she had carried in silence without ever speaking against him publicly. Naomi continued reading. I chose not to teach you hatred. Hatred would have allowed his fear to shape your future too. Instead, I prayed that one day, if life ever placed the two of you in the same room, the truth would speak louder than my pain. Naomi stopped. She folded the letter carefully. No dramatic gesture. No trembling voice. Only dignity. The attorney allowed several seconds to pass before asking another question. Did your mother identify your father in that letter? Naomi slowly nodded. Yes. And who did she name? Every person inside the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Naomi lifted her eyes. Not toward the judge. Not toward the attorney. Toward Daniel. Their eyes met for what felt like an eternity. Then she spoke with quiet certainty. Officer Daniel Brooks. A sharp gasp swept through the gallery. Reporters looked at one another in stunned disbelief. Pens began racing across notepads. The judge removed his glasses, visibly shaken by what he had just heard. Daniel stood frozen. His hands gripped the railing so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say he had been young, that the world had been different, that fear had clouded his judgment. But excuses sounded meaningless before they ever reached his lips. Because the woman standing only a few feet away wasn't asking for explanations. She was simply telling the truth. The attorney quietly asked one final question. Ms. Carter, before entering this courthouse this morning, had Officer Brooks ever spoken to you as his daughter? Naomi answered without hesitation. No. Did he know who you were? No. Then why didn't you tell him the moment he stopped you outside? Naomi looked down briefly before raising her eyes once more. Because character reveals itself most clearly before the truth arrives. The words settled over the courtroom with overwhelming weight. And Daniel finally understood that the greatest verdict waiting for him today would never come from the judge's bench. It had already been delivered by the daughter who had chosen dignity over revenge. The silence did not end with Naomi's words. It only grew heavier. Judge Harold Whitman remained motionless behind the bench, his fingers resting lightly on the polished wood. Reporters stared at one another, unsure whether they had just witnessed testimony, or history. Officer Daniel Brooks slowly released his grip on the courtroom railing. His hands were trembling. Not from anger. Not from fear of punishment. But from the crushing realization that the young woman standing before him had shown him more dignity in a single morning than he had shown her in an entire lifetime. The judge finally spoke. Officer Brooks. Daniel looked up. Would you care to respond to the testimony presented before this court? The veteran officer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He had spent nearly 30 years writing reports, giving statements, and answering difficult questions under pressure. Today, language abandoned him. His voice broke. I don't know where to begin. Judge Whitman nodded quietly. Then begin with the truth. Those 5 words struck Daniel harder than any sentence he had ever heard. He slowly stepped away from the defense table. Every eye followed him. Every camera remained fixed on his face. When he finally spoke again, his voice no longer carried the confidence of a decorated officer. It carried the weight of regret. Everything Ms. Carter said. He paused, struggling to breathe. Is true. A ripple moved through the courtroom. No one interrupted. No one celebrated. They simply listened. I met Angela when we were both young. His eyes drifted toward Naomi. I loved her. Another pause. But I loved my future more. Daniel lowered his head. I convinced myself I was protecting my career. His shoulders sagged beneath the uniform that had once filled him with pride. The truth is, I was protecting my own fear. The courtroom remained silent. Daniel continued. I let other people's prejudice become my excuse. He swallowed hard. I abandoned the woman I loved. His voice cracked again. And I abandoned the child I never even had the courage to meet. Naomi watched him quietly. Her expression did not change. She had not waited 30 years to hear an apology. She had come to tell the truth. Judge Whitman looked toward the attorneys before addressing the courtroom. The testimony heard today concerns matters beyond the scope of the present civil case. He paused. However, he turned toward Daniel. What occurred outside this courtroom this morning falls directly within this court's responsibility. Every reporter leaned forward. Judge Whitman's voice remained calm. Officer Brooks, multiple witnesses observed your treatment of Ms. Carter before these proceedings began. He glanced toward the bailiff. The court orders that surveillance footage from the courthouse entrance and hallway be preserved immediately. The clerk nodded. So ordered. Judge Whitman continued. In addition, this court will forward today's record to Internal Affairs and the appropriate oversight authorities for independent review. Daniel closed his eyes. He understood exactly what those words meant. The investigation. The suspension. The public scrutiny. Everything he had built over decades was beginning to collapse. Yet strangely, that no longer felt like the greatest consequence. He slowly turned toward Naomi. I can't ask you to forgive me. His voice was barely above a whisper. I lost the right to ask for that years ago. Naomi held his gaze with quiet compassion. When she finally spoke, her words carried neither triumph nor bitterness. I didn't come here to destroy your life. A long pause followed. I came here because no one, wearing a badge or not, is above the truth. And in that moment, Daniel Brooks understood that justice was not taking his career away. Justice was forcing him to become the man he should have been before he ever pinned a badge to his chest. 3 months later, the courthouse looked exactly the same. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. Deputies still greeted visitors at the entrance. Lawyers still hurried through the corridors carrying folders filled with ordinary cases. Yet for everyone who had witnessed that extraordinary morning, the building no longer felt ordinary. Some places remember the truth long after people leave them. Officer Daniel Brooks no longer wore a badge. The internal investigation had concluded that his conduct toward Naomi Carter violated departmental policy and the standards expected of every sworn officer. Before the disciplinary process reached its final stage, Daniel submitted his resignation. Many people assumed losing his career had been the greatest punishment. They were wrong. Every morning, Daniel woke knowing he had missed 30 years that could never be returned. No suspension. No resignation. No public embarrassment could compare with that realization. On a quiet autumn afternoon, he stood alone beneath an old oak tree in Greenwood Memorial Cemetery. Fresh flowers rested before Angela Carter's headstone. He knelt slowly. The same hands that had once worn handcuffs on countless suspects now trembled as they placed a single white rose beside her name. "I was too late," he whispered. The wind carried away the words before anyone else could hear them. Not far away, Naomi watched from a respectful distance. She hadn't come to witness his grief. She had come to visit her mother. After several silent moments, Daniel stood and carefully stepped aside. Neither of them spoke immediately. Some conversations need silence before they deserve words. Finally, Daniel looked toward her. "I don't expect another chance." Naomi nodded gently. "I know. I can't undo what I did." "No." Another long silence passed between them. Then Naomi offered the only truth that still mattered. "But every day gives you a chance to become someone different from the man who made that choice." Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time in decades, he wasn't searching for an excuse. He was listening. Weeks turned into months. Daniel quietly began volunteering at community programs that supported children growing up without parents at home. He never asked reporters to follow him. He never spoke publicly about redemption. He understood that real change didn't happen in front of cameras. It happened in ordinary moments when nobody was watching. Naomi never called him Dad. She wasn't ready. Perhaps she never would be. Healing could not be demanded. It could only be earned. Still, on rare occasions, they shared coffee after visiting Angela's grave. They spoke about books. About law. About the grandmother who had taught Naomi that dignity survives even the deepest wounds. Little by little, they stopped speaking only about the past. Sometimes they spoke about tomorrow. As winter gave way to spring, Daniel noticed something remarkable. Forgiveness wasn't a destination. Neither was justice. Both were journeys requiring honesty every single day. The courthouse where everything began continued welcoming strangers seeking fairness beneath the law. Most of them would never know that one ordinary hallway had once become the place where a father met the daughter he had abandoned, and where a daughter answered decades of silence not with revenge, but with truth. Because truth doesn't shout. It waits. Patiently. Until every excuse grows quiet enough to hear it. Daniel once believed a badge gave him authority over others. Naomi proved that true authority begins with accepting responsibility for yourself. And in the end, the most powerful verdict spoken that day never came from the judge seated behind the bench. It came from a daughter who refused to let hatred inherit the future. Because justice may correct what the law can reach. But only courage can begin to heal what fear destroyed.